Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Josephine Baker was one of the most well-known artistic stars globally in the 20th century for her work in music, dance, and film. Born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1906, Josephine Baker, as a young woman, would move to New York City where she would take to the stage, but with limited opportunities, likely or perhaps even primarily because she was black. She packed up and sailed off to Paris, where she became the first black woman to star in a major motion picture, the 1927 silent film Siren of the Tropics. From there, her stardom would only rise. However, with the onset of World War II and the Nazi occupation of France and the French Vichy government's collaboration with the Nazis, Josephine Baker joined the French resistance as a spy. It's only recently we've been learning the full extent, or at least more, about this particular story. In fact, my guest today, Damien Lewis, has written a book about it. The book is called Agent Josephine, American Beauty, French Hero, British Spy. Damien Lewis is an award-winning writer. He spent some 2 decades as a war correspondent with the BBC and other outlets. Damien Lewis, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this radio program.
Likewise, fabulous to be with you.
Your story focuses on Josephine Baker and really the war years, just before, just after, and we're definitely going to get into that story. For context, though, can we talk a little more about the backstory of Josephine Baker, who she was? Again, when I said she was a huge star globally. Can you talk to me about Josephine Baker as an entertainer?
Yeah, sure. So Josephine, as you know, grew up in St. Louis, in poverty, stealing coal from rail cars with her street gang, going to school barefoot. Kind of ran away from home in her early teens, and had this sense that via song and dance that she had this innate skill. Maybe she could make it on the stage and make a living that way and escape from poverty. So she found her way to New York, to the to Broadway, knowing that was the only place to try and break through. And as you said in your introduction, she found a part and she had several parts, but she never felt she could make it largely because of the Jim Crow, Jane Crow laws, segregation and prejudice. And at age 19, very young, was offered this lead role in the Revue Negre, a new show being put on in Paris, and took her heart and her soul in her hands and sailed on a liner for Europe, hoping that what she had heard, that it was relatively free of prejudice, would be true. And she arrived in Paris and was bowled over by the relative freedom she experienced there, and was embraced first by Paris and then by the rest of Europe. And by her early 20s, she'd taken the world capitals of Europe certainly by storm. She was feted in London, Berlin, Vienna, Paris, all over. And shortly she was a standout superstar. You could argue the world's first truly global superstar, the most photographed woman in the world, one of the highest paid entertainers in the world, an absolute icon of all those things that she stood for, and a standout star of song, dance, but also movies as well. So and she performed in Germany, in Berlin, and to rave reviews there as well. So Josephine found in Western Europe what she'd failed to find in the United States. And for her, before the rise of Nazi Germany, this really was a dream come true.
Yeah, and before the rise of Nazi Germany, obviously, is an important aspect of this story. Interestingly, there are many Black American writers and intellectuals in the 20th century that would make their way to Paris, form communities there. But Josephine Baker was one of the first, wasn't she?
She was a pioneer. On so many levels. We'll get more into that. I mean, civil rights wise as well, she was of course a pioneer. But she joined that kind of community. So she had Picasso and Hemingway and all these standout artists and writers of the day as her compatriots and close friends in Paris. This was the community that she fell into, and yeah, she was a trailblazer. But Josephine's ethnicity was part of her draw. It was intimately tied up with her success. The Revue Negre was a show peopled by black singers and dancers. It kind of played to that European stereotype of the noble savage, for want of a better expression. And Josephine knew exactly what she was doing. She played up to that because, she had a career to forge. And Josephine brought up in really, really tough times in St. Louis, during the race riots and all the rest of it. So Josephine was tough. She was a street fighter. She knew what she wanted, and she knew how to go out and get it. And in Paris and and across Europe, she was given that chance.
Yeah, and she's known as a black woman. I had read that she may have had indigenous ancestry as well.
Yeah, so she's the her folks were descendant slaves on her mother's side, okay, but there was also indigenous or Native American ancestry there too. But on the father's side, it's less certain. I mean, her father may have been white. He may have been a white German, in fact. There are reports that was the case, or that he was Spanish, or that it's unclear. And Josephine, she reinvented herself many times. She wrote her own story many times over, and often it differed. So the story of her parentage is kind of somewhat opaque, but certainly on the mother's side, it was slave ancestors and also Native American Indians ancestry as well.
In the late 1930s, I think it was 1937, she would renounce her American citizenship and become a French national.
Yeah, so she married a Jewish industrialist called Jean Lyon, and basically to get French citizenship in France at that time, which of course she would get by marriage, she had to renounce her American citizenship. So this was something she kind of had to do, and at that stage she said France has given me everything. She was willing to give France everything that she had, and that included her nationality as well. So yeah, that kind of came out of the union with Jean Lyon, but it was something that she wholly embraced.
1937, this is just a few years after the rise of the Nazis in Germany. It's not the official beginning of World War II yet, but is there a feeling in Europe about the rise of fascism that she's tuned into? I mean, as this European global star?
Yeah, absolutely. So Josephine, performed in Berlin and across Germany in the early 30s to absolute rave reviews and sellout shows. But she returned there later after the rise of the Nazis, and she was supposed to do a tour lasting many months, and she only survived for 3 weeks because the prejudice and the bile and the vitriol leveled at her from Nazis, brown shirts, black shirts, Hitler's thugs was so horrendous that she actually just couldn't stomach it and didn't feel safe and had to leave. So she very personally had come across the dark credo that Hitler and his cronies espoused, and she felt in her heart and was fearful because she knew what was coming, or she feared what was coming. And of course she feared that should the march of Nazi Germany and the military might that they were manufacturing, should that conquer in Western Europe, then the world, because that was the aim of Nazi Germany in Berlin, was world dominion. Then where could someone like her, or where could anybody, who was from within those groups of people that the Nazis were innately targeting, but also anybody who loved freedom and democracy and all the things we cherish, where could any of those people flee to next if the rise of Nazi Germany and Hitler wasn't stopped? That was her great fear.
It's really telling and poignant, the differences between when she performed in Germany in the early 30s, the reception they had for her, and then what would happen later. Just in a few years. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Just in a few years. And, two things kind of really, strike home about this time. So we're talking before the war. The first is that after Germany annexed Austria, you'll remember in the Anschluss, before the war, Hitler went to Vienna to kind of crow and strut his stuff. And he stayed in a hotel in which Josephine Baker had stayed when she performed there many years before. And he was incensed because there was a picture of Josephine Baker performing on the wall of his bedroom, which was absolutely not what Hitler wanted to find in newly seized Austria. And then secondly, Joseph Goebbels, who was the Nazi propaganda minister, put Josephine on the front cover of a pamphlet that they published, decrying kind of the freedoms and excesses that Nazi Germany stood against, and so identifying her as the kind of epitomizing the enemy of the Nazi state. This was before the outbreak of war and before the armor and the warplanes crossed the border into France.
Oh, so they used her in their propaganda.
Yeah.
Did the black shirts ever show up to her performances in Germany when she performed?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly what happened. I mean, horrendous, heckling, police protection. At times, she was banned from several German cities to perform because it was so dangerous. Part of the reason why she left. Horrendous articles in the press. Her co-star during that time was a white German female performer who actually stood up for her and said how horrendous and disgusting it was what was happening. But these powers at that time were triumphant and victorious. There was no stopping them, and all Josephine could do was flee.
What about her relationship to Italy and Mussolini? Did she know Mussolini?
She did. So she performed in Italy. She toured all European countries and further afield, actually, South America. But she performed in Italy and was kind of seduced, I don't think physically, but certainly intellectually by Mussolini. Because Mussolini, of course, was a fascist leader, but she believed in the Italian conquest of Abyssinia, then Abyssinia in East Africa, which Mussolini sold as a campaign to rid those people of East Africa from colonial slavery, which of course was not the case at all. It was naked Italian aggression and colonialization for themselves. But Josephine believed his kind of propaganda, and for a while kind of came behind Mussolini and supported him. She wasn't always the best judge of character, it has to be said, but she was very frank about that. She was like, sometimes I make these knee-jerk reaction responses, and sometimes I call it wrong. But the great thing is, I think she kind of turned that around and used her kind of contacts and her in with the Italians to absolutely, fantastic ends just prior to the war in terms of gathering intelligence for the Allies.
Yeah. What would happen between her and Mussolini then? Would she renounce him?
No. Basically, what happened was she saw the error of her views, but she didn't publicly go out there and kind of decry Mussolini. There was no need. I mean, war was coming. There were far greater things to prepare for. But she was tasked in one of her earliest espionage missions before the actual outbreak of war to find out for the Allies what the intentions of the Italians would be. Should Nazi Germany declare war? Because of course we needed to know that, and we also need to know what the intention of the Japanese would be. And so she used the fact she had this special status with the Italians to go to the Italian embassy in Paris to meet with and seduce intellectually, perhaps physically, the Italian defense attaché, and to get a chapter and a verse from him about what Italy was intending. And so that intelligence was her first mission, actually. It was like a test mission. That intelligence went straight to the senior powers in France and Britain, and was absolutely solid gold at that time.
That's interesting. Yeah, that she used her friendship with Mussolini and her relationship with Italy in general in order to do work as a spy during the war. What was she? It wasn't known at the time by most people that she was a spy. There wasn't a lot known for decades after the war that she was a spy. Again, this is sort of a different story that you tell in your book about Josephine Baker as a spy. But in her time, was she vocal at all about the rise of fascism?
Yes, she was, absolutely. Yeah, no, she was a standout opponent. So I'll give you an example. This is before she was recruited as an agent. So the defences of France were predicated on the Maginot Line. This massive line of fortifications, obviously outdated, and it didn't stand a chance when the forces of Nazi Germany invaded. But Josephine went and performed along the Maginot Line to the troops and was very outspoken in both decrying the rise of Nazism and, bolstering the morale of the troops. That's British and French and other Allied troops along the Maginot Line. And she also was outspoken in saying that, during the phony war, after war was declared, but during the phony war, when both sides were sat there kind of waiting the next side's move, she was a vocal advocate of the fact that France should strike first, that France should actually go and move on Germany before Germany moved on France. So yeah, she was very vocal and very outspoken in her defiance of Berlin, and even after France was invaded and taken by the Nazis, she pledged. When that happened, she pledged, and she stood by that pledge largely, that she would never perform on the stage, either singing or dancing, whilst there was a Nazi remaining in France.
Did she ever talk about leaving Jim Crow America, which, some have called America's own form of fascism, going to Paris, and then now on the other side seeing the rise of Nazi Germany and eventually the invasion of Germany into France?
Yeah, of course. This was like, you can imagine it. She escapes America and finds all the freedom she's ever dreamt of, and then suddenly, within the space of a few years, she faces the prospect of them all being taken away from her. And an awful lot of people who've read the book have said, or have asked, why did she stay and fight? Why did she stay and volunteer herself as a spy? She was the citizen of a neutral nation, America. She could simply have done what most Americans did when France was invaded and queue at the American embassy in Paris, get her papers and her visas, and travel home. In fact, she would have been at the front of the queue, being who she was. But Josephine never for one moment even contemplated doing it. She was only ever going to stay and fight. And she was fighting for what she believed in, but what also had made her life so special once she had moved to Europe. So, I mean, in my own view, I don't think she felt there was even a choice to be made. There was no choice. The only choice to make was to stay and fight the rise of this evil and hate-filled and prejudice-filled credo.
One last context question here before we really dive into her as a spy. Talk to me about France in World War II. A very different relationship than, say, what you would get with Poland or some of the other countries that Germany conquered.
Yeah, so, France in World War II, France fell because France wasn't ready. France didn't want to believe that a second world war was coming. Bear in mind, the First World War was fresh in people's memories still, barely 2 decades old, if that, war wounded on the streets still, millions who had died. No one in France was willing or wanted to believe that there could be a new war with the old enemy. They just wouldn't countenance it. And not only that, one thing I think we tend to forget is that the propaganda pumped out from Berlin and Germany was brilliant, was fantastic, was extremely well done. And what the German propaganda machine was saying in France was, why would we ever attack westwards? We are here as a bulwark against Russia and the rise of communism. So if anywhere we're going to move eastwards, France has nothing to worry about. We're all on the same side. That was the propaganda that was being pumped into France, and many chose to believe it. So when the French and British intelligence services, who worked very closely, hand in glove with each other in the run-up to the war, when they contemplated what they knew was coming, which was a military invasion by Nazi Germany, they feared and they were certain that France would not stand, that France would fall. And they tried to warn their political taskmasters in France and Britain, but no one wanted to hear. And no one wanted to fund the intelligence services. No one wanted to build up their militaries, because it just wasn't something that either public was willing to countenance.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Damien Lewis. Damien Lewis is the author of the book that we're in conversation about. It's called Agent Josephine, American Beauty, French Hero, British Spy. How does Josephine Baker get recruited to become a spy, and who is she a spy for?
So, because the French intelligence service was so woefully underfunded, they had very, very few agents, and by contrast, the American intelligence service, the Abwehr, was flooding France with spies. I mean, massively funded and massively supported, and the French knew this. It was very blatant. The Abwehr were almost doing this as a provocation to say, what are you going to do about it? And the French intelligence services felt desperate. There's no other word for it. And in that desperation, they set upon something which tried and trusted policy. It's been used before, of recruiting what they called honourable correspondents. Now, honourable correspondents are freelance, voluntary spies who spy for love of country, love of freedom, love of democracy, love of peace. And they're generally individuals who you recruit because they have a reason to spy, because of who they are or what they do. So, for example, authors and journalists make very good honorary correspondence because we go to places, we ask questions, and we write stuff down. It's a very, very good cover. So too do industrialists who are involved in international industry, but also there is some tradition of entertainers being honorary correspondents because they travel the world and they move in high society circles. And so at some stage before the war, the suggestion was mooted by the Deuxième Bureau, which was the French counterintelligence service, counter-espionage service, that Josephine Baker, the superstar, should be recruited. And it was not a popular suggestion for two reasons. First of all, at that time, it was the belief that women did not make very good agents. That was the first problem. And the second, and by the way, all the people contemplating recruiting Josephine were men. These were male agents. And secondly, and I paraphrase, they worried that she would be like one of those shallow showbiz personalities who would shatter like glass at the first hint of any danger. That's what they believed Josephine was. And there was not a great deal of enthusiasm to recruit her. However, Colonel Paul Peylol, who was the head of the German desk at the Deuxième Bureau, insisted that they give it a try. And he dispatched a seasoned French agent called Jacques Abtey, Captain Jacques Abtey, to Josephine's chateau, Le Vessinet, Le Beauchesne in the Vessinet, a very nice part of Paris, to sound her out. And Abtey drove over to the chateau with very slim hopes, really not relishing his mission at all. He turns up there expecting to see Josephine, the archetypal Josephine, and that is, the ball gown, dripping in jewelry, absolutely beautiful, maybe with a pet cheetah Chiquita on its diamond-studded leash. She was a lifelong lover of animals, and she used animals, her cheetah and monkeys and anacondas and snakes and her Great Dane Bonzo. She used them as a stage menagerie for her performances. So Abtey was expecting that kind of stereotypical image, and he turns up there and drives through the gate, and there's a cry of hello from the bushes, and it's Josephine, but she's emerged in a battered felt hat, some old gardening clothes, and a rusty tin can full of snails, and she's collecting the snails to feed her pet ducks. That's the other side of Josephine the public didn't get to see. That's the down to earth, in her garden, tough on the streets, practical Josephine. And Abtey was surprised is an understatement. So she takes him into the chateau. She serves him champagne, or the butler does. They're in front of the fireplace, and Abtey gets treated to something, the second thing he wasn't expecting. And this is the watershed moment in Josephine's recruitment. So one of her dancers, who is still alive and he lives in Paris, a lovely individual called Jean-Pierre Reguiori, French of origin but lives in New York now. He's explained to me what it was like to be with Josephine and to perform on stage with her. He said she had this unique je ne sais quoi, what he terms the Josephine effect, which is she could reach out from the stage and touch every single member of the audience personally. It was uncanny. It was almost as if she could make every single person there believe that she was performing or singing and dancing for him or for her personally. And Jean-Pierre Reguiori said he'd never seen anything like it in a performer before or since. And she treated Jacques Abtey to an up-close version of that, sat in front of the Vessinet fireplace. You can imagine it. Abtey he's bewitched and entranced. And he thinks to himself, boy, if we can harness the Josephine effect, to the world of intelligence gathering, there is nobody that we can't send Josephine after who she won't be able to seduce and persuade to talk. And so, he has to pop the question, and, how do you recruit someone as an honorary correspondent? You can't just walk in their door and say, hey, would you like to spy for France or Britain or America? You do the small talk and you try and send them out. Well, he does say to her eventually, look, I guess you know why I'm here. We want you to, spy for France. And she says, and again, I paraphrase, Paris has made me everything. France has given me all that I have. I will give to the French people in this country my life. Use me as you will. And so that's when Abtey sets her that first mission, to go to the Italian embassy and find out what the intentions are of the Italians should war be declared. And the fascinating thing, the kind of fascinating, amusing thing about that mission is that when a week later Josephine calls Jacques Abtey and says, we need to meet, you'd never say anything of any substance over the phone because the Germans were listening in, and vice versa. Just, we need to meet. So they meet up, but they meet up in Josephine's Delage, very luxurious motor car. upholstered in snakeskin, and she's driving through central Paris, and she's so excited and nervous at what she's found out that she's driving like a drunk. She's all over the road, and a Paris gendarme arrests them, thinking it's a drunk driver at the wheel. Then he realizes it's Josephine Baker, so he lets her go with a caution. And on the one hand, Jacques Abte is amazed at what she's found out, and so quickly, this is dynamite. On the other hand, he's thinking, how will I ever manage, control, and handle, and train, and shape this rookie agent? Because this is like being harnessed to a runaway train. And then she gets her second mission, which is to do exactly the same with the Japanese, to find out what the intentions of the Japanese will be. Should war be declared. And again, she has a fantastic connection to the Japanese embassy and finds out chapter and verse about what the Japanese are intending, and that they've already cut a deal with Berlin, with Nazi Germany, that when war is declared, they will be on Berlin's side against the Allies. So
she finds
very
this
quickly
out
she's
first.
delivered.
She finds this out first.
Yeah. So she finds that, she gathers that intelligence, that proof for the Allies. I mean, the way that intelligence is kind of graded, you have letters and numbers, so like A1, B4, all the way down the scale, and intelligence delivered by a known source, or like a honorary correspondent from someone like the military attaché at the Italian embassy, that's pretty high up the scale, as you can imagine. That's pretty much from the horse's mouth. Better still would be a photocopy of the actual, deal signed between the Italians and Germans. But second to that, this is about as good as it gets. So yeah, she's delivered exactly what Abte has asked for in a very short period of time. But at the same time, he's aware that she's a force of nature. And it's going to be an interesting time trying to handle Josephine.
During World War II, it wasn't unusual to have a movie or a singer, some star, work as a spy. That's because they're widely accepted. They get to travel around. How did Josephine Baker use her stardom for this espionage work?
Yeah, it's a great question, and that's kind of what drew me to this story, 10 years ago or so, when I first read somewhere that, Josephine Baker was a spy. And I thought, well, that's impossible. She was so instantly recognizable, so high profile. Come on, how could she serve as an agent of the shadows? That's supposed to be the grey man or the grey woman, the person nobody notices. That's our kind of archetypal, view of a spy. For Josephine, her stardom was her cloak and her dagger. So she hid in plain sight. Her very stardom was what gave her the cover to carry out these missions, because those two missions that I've just described, Italy and Japan, they weren't easy, but they were fairly benign because France had not yet been invaded. Okay, we flash forward to summer 1940. France has been invaded, and Josephine undertakes a mission, which she's given by Colonel Paul Pelol of the Deuxième Bureau. But now, of course, the Deuxième Bureau's had to go underground because, France is either occupied or it's under Vichy control, which is, in collaboration with Berlin. And so the underground French intelligence service carries on gathering intelligence all through the summer of 1940, but it has no way to get it to Britain, which at that stage is the only dog in the fight, because all those connections have fallen apart. The speed of the fall of France was so precipitate, so quick, that not even those in the intelligence world who knew that France would fall had foreseen this happening. And so they're in chaos, utter chaos. And, actually Churchill held a meeting in June 1940 with his top intelligence chiefs and said, look, we know the Battle of Britain is upon us. The Blitz is coming. Operation Sea Lion. Nazi Germany's poised to invade British shores. We have nothing. We've got no visibility in France. We've got not a single agent, not a single wireless set. How can you get us back into France? Well, Colonel Pelol gets Abte to approach Josephine, and at this stage she's fled Paris. Obviously, Paris is occupied by the forces of Nazi Germany, and she's moved to her chateau in the Dordogne, so in rural France, south of Paris. And there she's organised kind of an ad hoc resistance cell. It's Jewish refugees, it's a few former French intelligence agents, some former military guys, but they have no idea what form resistance will take, or even if France will resist. In those early days, nobody knew. And then Captain Abte turns up, and he brings with him the first of these files of intelligence gathered by the underground French intelligence service that summer. And he says, we need to get these to Britain. We need to reopen that pipeline, that flow of intelligence, and we think you are the person who can do it. And so the idea was that Josephine, because of her stardom, and because people still need to be entertained even in a time of war, she could travel to somewhere like Portugal, a neutral nation, put on some shows as her excuse to be there. And when Josephine Baker travelled, she travelled with dozens of tour trunks, obviously, and they were full of her costumes, her jewellery, but also her musical score sheets. And in there would be hidden the intelligence. And in Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, there's a British embassy. The British embassy has a secret intelligence service cell. And so all they had to do was get these files to the British embassy, and the secret intelligence service could then take over and get them to London. That was the plan. And so Josephine embraces it wholeheartedly. She organises bona fide shows in Lisbon. There are posters of Josephine Baker pasted all over the street. She is going to perform there and sing and dance her heart out. And Jacques Abde gets busy writing in invisible ink in between the musical scores of sheets, in between the music, the secret intelligence material that they need to carry with them. But some of it actually has to go as raw intelligence. So we're talking, like photographs of the invasion craft that the forces of Germany are building to invade Britain. Luftwaffe signals intercepts. Some of this is just raw intelligence that has to go as it is. The point being that should she get stopped and searched, it will be found. And the bad guys will realise what Josephine Baker is really up to. And then, let's be frank about it, death is about the best thing that could happen to someone like Josephine, because the Gestapo and the SS, of course, had far worse things that they did to female agents that they captured. And they did it all throughout the war. They murdered hundreds, torture, rape, sexual abuse. I mean, just the worst things you can possibly imagine. And, this was widespread. Women were given no mercy whatsoever. In fact, they were treated on some levels worse than men, because they were seen as being more vulnerable because of their sexuality. So Josephine, she knows what she's facing, and, discovery would mean far worse than death. No shadow of a doubt. And that's the mission she sets off on. October 1940, with Abte, travelling by train and by aircraft, they set off to take all of the intelligence gathered by the French intelligence services over that summer and autumn to London, if they can get it there.
Does she ever get caught or almost get caught?
Even before this, she's got caught. Okay, so in the summer of 1940, before Abte, turns up with this mission, she's gathering weaponry and trying to gather intelligence. They have a wireless set in one of the towers. They can't make contact yet, but they're trying to. This is a DIY resistance operation, okay? And she gets denounced by someone in the local community. And so one day, unannounced, a colonel of the Armistice Commission, which was the body set up by Nazi Germany to police the armistice, the deal cut between France and Germany to stop the fighting, okay? A colonel of the Armistice Commission turns up, his soldiers surround the chateau, and he marches his way into the library. And Josephine has just been meeting with two intelligence agents from the Deuxième Bureau, now underground, of course, who've been handing over some intelligence to her and have bought weapons. So she hurries them out into hiding and receives this colonel, SS Gestapo colonel. And the most amazing thing about that confrontation, the most striking, mind-blowing thing, is he expects to walk in, of course, in his jackboots, and Josephine to be terrified and to be guilty. She does the absolute opposite. She is icy, unfriendly in the extreme, and she accuses him. She says, "What on earth are you doing here, listening to denouncers, trusting their word over mine? How dare you come here and do that?" And he's bowled over. He thinks, well, if she was guilty of hiding weapons and organising, resistance to Nazi Germany, this is not how she would behave. And eventually he actually asks her, well, can I at least have a cup of coffee? And she says, I would offer you a cup of coffee if I had any, but there is none because since you've invaded illegally into our country, there's no coffee available anymore. If you leave and go back to Berlin, maybe there'll be some coffee available then. And if you came back in peace, I'd welcome you into my home. So she's I mean, just it's the standout performance of her life, you could argue. And the colonel leaves believing that what she said is true, that that she has been denounced by someone who's purely envious of her status, and she's a chatelaine and a superstar, and that there is nothing to look for here. They don't even search the chateau.
Wow. This is a story not well known. How is it that you found this story? What has happened to make this story available? Not only, obviously, you're not going to be public about being a spy while you're a spy, but it also wasn't made public for many decades until recently.
Yeah, so Josephine never really spoke about, her spying work. She spoke about World War II. After the war, whenever anybody asked her, right until her dying day, what are you most proud of in your life? She would always say, the World War II years. This was the making of Josephine as a serious campaigner for civil rights and freedom, that she became during the war and after the war and to her dying day. But she never spoke about her secret spying work. And that's only to be expected. I mean, nobody did. That's what you did as a spy. You did not speak about what you did because it was secret. If you served in any way, shape, or form the Deuxième Bureau, you were expected to remain silent for at least 3 decades. At least 3 decades. And most people did until, took their secrets to their deathbed. Well, sadly, Josephine passes away before those 3 decades are up in any case, but she never spoke about it in any great depth at all. So she wrote a biography with the man she married after the war, Joe Billon. It was published posthumously, actually, after her death, but she wrote it with him. There's almost nothing in there about her spying work at all. So Josephine, like so many of these agents, went to the grave with most of these things unsaid and untold. However, several things, happened and have happened, which would make the story possible to tell now. And I don't think it would have been possible even 2 or 3 years ago. So the key thing, and they deserve massive, massive credit for this, the French government released 18 months ago or so, in fact, it was during the COVID lockdown, a raft of files about the spying operations of the Deuxième Bureau and these kind of agents during World War II. And that included Josephine's files and Jacques Abte's files and Colonel Paul Pelot's files, the key characters involved. Abte, by the way, is her spying partner throughout the whole of the war. They are inseparable. They also have a romantic relationship as well. They become lovers too, but they are this world-beating spying partnership. So those files are absolute gold dust. Without those, you couldn't tell the story. Certain things become absolutely, crystal clear from those files. For example, that she spied for Britain and for America, as well as France. And as the war progressed, increasingly for Britain and increasingly for the United States, because, of course, they became the main powers fighting the war. So that the release of those files was absolutely, vital. But Jacques Abte wrote an account of their war together in French, and then Colonel Remy, who was a standout, probably the most famous French resistance leader during the war, he wrote his own version of Jacques Abte and Josephine's story much later. Several decades after the war, which is a fantastic account of their espionage at work. And I've been in close contact with Colonel Remy's descendants and Jacques Abte's descendants, his son and Colonel Remy's family, and they've shared with me not only those manuscripts but also other family archival documents as well. So those things are key. And then most books have this kind of journey where serendipity comes into play. And just one of the kind of magical moments in writing this story was that so Josephine's handler in London, who she knew before the war because he was the Secret Intelligence Service's spy master in Paris, was this amazing character called Commander Wilfred Biffy Dunderdale. And Dunderdale, believe it or not, was one of Ian Fleming's key role models for James Bond, because Fleming and Dunderdale knew each other and worked together during the war. So Dunderdale was the Paris spy master prior to the war, knew Josephine, knew Jacques Abdin, knew Colonel Penol, worked very closely with them. So when France falls and Josephine is tasked to reopen this intelligence pipeline between France and Britain, she does so. She gets all that material to Lisbon. It gets sent to London, and it's Commander Dunderdale who becomes her handler in London. Okay, and he then handles her and Jacques Abdin throughout the war until like late 1943, early 44. And Commander Dunderdale, again, another of these individuals, this man is so legendary within British spying circles that to this day, in the training centre for Secret Intelligence Service agents in the UK, in the mess, so where they dine and have formal dinners and evenings, on the table in the mess, there is a silver bowl engraved with Wilfred Dunderdale's name and his kind of credentials, because he's the inspiration for agents to this day. But Dunderdale went to his grave never speaking publicly about anything he did in a lifetime spent fighting the War of the Shadows. Anyway, Dunderdale's personal private archive is owned by a guy who's British but now lives in the States, called Paul Biddle. And Paul reached out to me during the process of my researching this book. He'd somehow heard what I was doing. I don't know how. And he said, I have all of Dunderdale's private archive, including letters from the Secret Intelligence Service bosses to him, etc., etc. Would you like access to it? And, that's, again, it's gold dust. You can't, of course I said that I would be overjoyed. And so he sent me everything. And without that kind of patchwork of materials that you start to build the story from, it wouldn't be possible to tell the tale as I've been able to do. And then, of course, you have to sift the truth out of all this material, because lots of different people have told lots of different versions of the story for conflicting agendas. So America wasn't occupied by Nazi Germany, neither was Britain, thank God, but France was. And so that occupation set, village against village, household against household, sometimes brother against brother, sometimes father against son. It was horrendous. You read the accounts of what took place, collaborators versus resistance fighters and everything in between. And those wounds run deep, they cut deep, and they persist to this day. And so people wrote accounts of what had happened during the war for hidden agendas and for various different reasons. And you have to sift and work out why people have said the version of events that they have said. And then Jacques and Josephine, one of the things that I love about their story and which kind of drew me to it, they were willing to work with anyone to defeat Nazi Germany. They'd work with the devil if they had to. They didn't care. So they worked with forgers and assassins and the mafia. So the American government had cut a deal with Lucky Luciano's mafia early on in the war. It's called Operation Underworld. All the files have been released. And the deal was, look, you secure the New York docks for us because of the U-boat predations and spies, and we will cut you an easy deal as in terms of mafia operations. And the mafia said, look, hell, why stop there? We have networks all over the world. We can gather intelligence, we can run weapons, we can drop agents off. And so this was the kind of deal that was put together. Well, in North Africa, in Morocco, where Jacques and Josephine eventually end up, because that's where they're running this kind of intelligence pipeline via now to go get material to London. In North Africa, they cut a deal with the local franchise of Lucky Luciano's New York Mafia, okay? And the deal is you go out there and gather the intelligence for us, and we will get you bootleg cigarettes, English bootleg cigarettes, which are, that was the absolute gold in terms of what to smuggle at that time. And that's exactly what they do. They get Royal Naval ships, believe it or not, to deliver caseloads of cigarettes, British cigarettes, to the mafia off the coast of North Africa to oil the wheels of this intelligence gathering operation, and the mafia hand over the intelligence they've gathered. So they were willing to work with anyone and everyone. And during a time of war, all of this is fine, whatever it takes. But once the war is over, you've pushed the boundaries of legality. Sometimes you've crossed over those boundaries of legality. Sometimes you've done so with no blessing whatsoever from your taskmasters, because you don't have much contact with them. You're pretty much out there gathering intelligence like as you can at the coalface. And so some of these stories couldn't be told because things had been done which weren't, as we'd say in England, weren't cricket, weren't how how the game is played. Everyone was at it. The British government was at it. The American government was at it. But some of this stuff you could argue was incriminating if you told the truth immediately after the war. And so the truth wasn't told, or versions of the truth were told that kind of put the blame for organizing this with other people, not with yourselves.
Complicated. What happens after a country is occupied? One I hadn't really thought about, but you really lay out there. How is Josephine Baker received in France in the years after the war?
So Josephine, came back from, the war, and one thing, to be absolutely clear about, she fought her War of the Shadows and performed to the troops, not just until Allied forces marched into Berlin and VE Day and VJ Day were declared, but until the concentration camps were liberated. And she performed in the concentration camps after the war was over to the dead and the dying. So she started off her activities before the war was declared. She lasted.
She performed for people who were in concentration camps after.
Yeah, she performed in Buchenwald, for example, in the concentration camp. The Allies put out a call for any entertainer who was willing to enter, these places of horror and darkness, which were riven with typhoid, by the way. So, you're taking your life in your hands just going in there. And Josephine had been very ill, for 18 months or so during 43 and 44, hadn't stopped her in her spying work, but very, very ill, on death's door. Many times, her those caring for her medics thought she was going to pass away, and it was the cumulative effect of all of her spying missions, often solo, by the way, on her own, out there on the edge. All the stress and the strain and the fear had really got to her, and she became very ill. But she still went in to those concentration camps after the war and performed. Absolutely amazing testament to her belief that what she was doing was right, and that, thank God freedom had triumphed. And, having said that, so she was given the medaille, the Freedom Medal, okay, by de Gaulle, in 1946. She was in hospital, ill after the war, feeling the very serious effects of how she had given herself and what she'd sacrificed during the war. And de Gaulle sent his daughter to actually present the Medal of Freedom to Josephine, but she was put forward for the Légion d'honneur and the Croix de Guerre, two high valor French medals. And she was refused, and she was repeatedly refused, actually, until the early 1950s. And it took the intervention of several highly placed kind of military and resistance figures, one of whom was Dumézil-Guillet, who was the female commander who had recruited Josephine eventually into basically the French Air Force towards the end of the war. So she actually had a formal kind of military cover for her work. And Dumézil-Guillet actually says in the documents that have been released by the French government, is it her gender that's contributing to you not giving her the Croix de Guerre and Légion d'honneur, or is it her race? Which is it? Because it has to be one or the other, or maybe both. So it does become pretty political. Eventually, 1957, she gets awarded both, and then of course, later on, much later, only very recently, in the last year or so, she's elevated to the French Pantheon, and she's one of only 80-something individuals and half a dozen women who have been given the highest honor of the French nation, so to be interred in the Pantheon. So
the only black woman, right?
And the only black woman, yeah. So this is a real standout honor. And I was in France over the summer. I obviously I've been there many times researching this story, and Josephine is revered there. She's an iconic standout figure, and her chateau in Milan, Chateau de Milan, is a living memorial to her life and work, and it's amazing. It's really, really worth a visit. It's one of the most extraordinary places I've been to in terms of a memorial to one individual's resistance. And one wing of the entire chateau is about her World War II work. Of course, it's also about her career before the war as an entertainer and her career after the war as an entertainer and civil rights activist. But, the war takes center stage. So, yeah, she is absolutely a hero of the French nation to this day.
Josephine Baker would die in 1975. As you mentioned, within the last year or so, she was interred into the French Pantheon. The building's modeled after the Roman Pantheon. It's where the great French historical figures go after they die. Their bodies, I think her body's still in her original grave, though. I think they just put up a plaque or something.
That's right, yeah. So she's buried in Monaco, and they didn't want to actually, inter the remains. So there is a plaque, and there's a ceremonial or symbolic sarcophagus and a plaque.
Yeah, and again, it being within the last year or so, this seems to correspond, at least in time. Maybe there's not a connection to the story about her being a spy also becoming public. Is there a connection?
There may well be. It's obviously a decision made at some reasonably high level by the French government to release those files. Just to put it in context, files pertaining to the work of the British Secret Intelligence Service are never released. That's it. You never see any of them. Doesn't matter how old they are, what conflict or theatre they date back to, they are never released. So it's a seriously, it's a great symbolic step by the French government to release those files, in my view. And so, yes, perhaps that was done with a view to Josephine's pantheonization. I don't know. What I do know is that the Service Historique de la Défense, so the French kind of military archives government organization, has been very proactive in promoting Josephine's wartime record and the fact that these files are available. And they've been extremely helpful with me personally in terms of researching this book. So there is certainly a desire within the French establishment to have this story of her wartime activities more widely known. And you can kind of understand why, millions of people of color, people from the Indian subcontinent, from West Africa, from these states, served in the Second World War, and not very many of their stories are known. So, getting more of these stories out there can only be a good thing. And perhaps that's partly what lies behind the French government's desire to put this story out there.
It's very interesting. Damien Lewis has been our guest. He has joined us for a conversation about Josephine Baker and her time as a spy during World War II. Damien Lewis is the author of the book Agent Josephine, American Beauty, French Hero, British Spy. Damien Lewis, I found that fascinating, and I thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.